Hey everybody, welcome to our first recorded lecture for History 202. I know that you were expecting to see World War II, and this looks suspiciously like our PowerPoint from last week on the New Deal. That's because with all of the confusion and with me getting sick, we weren't able to cover the second New Deal last week. So I want to give you just a very quick sort of lecture on that to make sure that we're all caught up, and then you will have a couple of more videos on World War II and on what we're going to be doing for the rest of the week. So in total, these videos will be no more than 50 minutes, which is our normal lecture time, but they're going to be broken up into a few different videos just to make it easier to watch. Before we get started with that, I just wanted to reiterate something that I said in my email that I sent out this morning, which is that I really do want to make sure that this transition is as easy as possible for all of us and that you get the most out of your educational experience. I know that an online course is not what you signed up for, and you know that I'm trying to figure out this transition as well. So please do let me know about what is and isn't working for you in terms of things like recorded lectures, and I really will try and take that feedback and make the course as good as I can. One thing that you might notice, depending on when you're watching this video, is that for right now, there are not closed captions. I am working on that. That's something I'm working on figuring out with this software. And there should be closed captions on all the videos within a couple of days. So just bear with me on that for now. All right, so let's get started on the New Deal. So last week, we talked about Herbert Hoover and the Great Depression. He was the president who was president when the Great Depression started, and he wasn't really prepared to deal with it, as we saw. The old ways of dealing with economic downturns just didn't work because of the severity of this Great Depression. So in 1932, sort of at the worst point of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected and put forth the New Deal, which was his way of trying to address the economic crisis. So we're going to focus mostly on the second New Deal, the second phase of the New Deal, which we did not get to do last week. But before we do that, I wanted to address something within the first New Deal that came up last week and that I told you I would give you more information about on Friday, and then we didn't meet Friday. So that has to do with the Glass-Steagall Act, which was part of the Emergency Banking Act. One of the first things that FDR tried to deal with when he came into office was the banking crisis, the fact that people were panicking and trying to get all their money out of banks. Banks were closing, and FDR introduced a bank holiday and a bunch of new regulation to try and stabilize banking practices to make them safer in the future. So one of the things that the Glass-Steagall Act did, as we learned last week, was that it separated personal banking, so when the bank takes your money and holds on to it for you, it separated that into one thing, and then stock market stuff into another thing. So the bank couldn't do both of those things in the same institution. And the idea there is that the bank can't take your money that you give it for savings and use it to do things on the stock market that might be riskier than what you signed up for. I said in class last week that this was repealed as part of the financial crisis or Great Recession in 2008. And Tyler pointed out it was actually repealed in 1999. So I've looked into this and I have clarification for you. What happened was, Tyler is right, it was repealed under the Clinton administration in 1999. But there were a lot of rules put into place if you, as a bank, decided that you wanted to put personal banking and stock market operations under the same institution. There was a lot of federal oversight that you had to deal with, a lot of regulations. So most banks opted to keep those two things separate, but some banks put them back together, and those were the banks that were deemed too big to fail during the Great Recession and that needed to be bailed out by the government. And so at the time, in 2008, a lot of people were blaming the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act for the onset of the Great Recession. Now, with some hindsight, economists sort of agree that, well, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act might have helped to bring the Great Recession, might have helped to make it happen. It wasn't the main factor. And so that's sort of where I had gotten that political rhetoric confused. And thank you again for pointing that out so that I was able to clarify. All right, so today we are going to spend more of our time in this video focusing on the second New Deal. We had talked before about the idea that the first New Deal was emergency measures. It was everybody trying to figure out what we can do in this financial emergency to try and get people back to work, to try and get all of these downward economic spirals to stop so that the economy could start to recover. The second New Deal was more about lasting expansion. FDR saw that some of the policies he had put into place in the first New Deal were working. He felt like that meant that those things should be put into place as permanent measures in order to stabilize the economy and prevent a Great Depression from happening in the future. This became much more controversial. He had much less cooperation from Congress when it came to the second New Deal because everyone was kind of willing to work together when there was this giant crisis. But when it came to fundamentally and permanently changing the way that the government interacted with people, people were less certain that that was something that they wanted to buy into. So Roosevelt's second New Deal lasted from about 1935 to about 1939. It really got going after 1936 when Roosevelt was reelected for the first time. So he was elected for the first time in 1932. He was reelected for the first time in 1936. And he was reelected in a landslide. And so he really felt like he had a mandate from the people to keep going with the New Deal and to make it more permanent. And so he wanted to see a lasting expansion of the federal government. As we saw, the first New Deal expanded the federal government's role in business, in agriculture, in housing, in pretty much all aspects of the economy. And he especially wanted to make sure that there was a lasting economic security for people, which he put into place through the Social Security Act, which established the Social Security Administration. And that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of this lecture, because that's sort of the most lasting thing in the second New Deal. It's the thing that still affects us the most to this day. So this is an ad from the time for the Social Security Administration, and it's pointing out one of the more popular parts of the Social Security Act of 1935, which is old age pensions. So as you all know, probably, when you get paid, there's a little bit of money that comes out of your paycheck and that goes into Social Security with the idea that when you retire, the government will pay you a pension so that everyone hopefully is able to retire. This was meant to create some kind of economic security for people. It was also meant to encourage older people to retire so that there were jobs available for younger people. The Social Security Act also introduced unemployment insurance. So one of the things we talked about last week was that with the development of broad consumer economies, this created a downward spiral when people started losing their jobs. So if someone lost their job and stopped buying their regular Coca-Cola, stopped buying pants, whatever, it would mean that the Coca-Cola factory would have to start laying off workers, the pants factory would have to start laying off workers, and it would create this downward spiral like we saw in the Great Depression, which led to, at its worst point, 25% unemployment. So the framers of the New Deal figured if we give people a little bit of money when they are laid off to help carry them over until they get another job, that will stop them from pulling all of their money out of the economy. It will allow them to keep buying things so that their job loss doesn't lead to more job loss. The Social Security Act also established aid to families with dependent children. This is the agency that most of us are thinking of when we talk about welfare. This is the agency that deals with things like giving monthly allowances to people who are out of work, giving money for people to help raise their children if they're on a lower income scale. And then also aid for the disabled, which again is another kind of welfare. At the time, all of this fell under what was called the welfare state. I know that now in American political rhetoric, welfare can be a kind of divisive word. It's something that some people really support, some people really oppose. In the 1930s, governments around the world were starting to develop what they called welfare states, which are essentially just government programs designed to help take care of people when people aren't able to take care of themselves. And this was sort of an extension of the progressive era idea that bigger government could create a better society. So I just want to sort of point out, this is what it means at the time. I know that it has sort of a different connotation now. Although I also want to say that that connotation, that kind of negative connotation that we have, or that you might have towards welfare, was something that was kind of built into the system from the beginning. So the idea of the New Deal, the idea of Social Security, was premised on a really specific idea of a worker and helping to support workers. And in the minds of people in the 1930s, a worker was a man, usually a man who worked to support his family. And so the things that were for men who worked to support their families, things like old age pensions, were considered entitlements. These were things that the people who designed the New Deal saw as things that the people who got them deserved. They deserved to have this because they worked. Whereas the other things, unemployment insurance, aid to families with dependent children, aid to the disabled, all of those things were labeled welfare. And from the very beginning, they were thought of as things that people didn't necessarily, quote unquote, deserve, but that the government would give them sort of out of the kindness of its heart. That's not necessarily my opinion, but that's how this was all designed. And so when people opposed the expansion of the welfare state, which they did from the very beginning, it was really hard for them to attack things like old age pensions, but it was pretty easy to start to dismantle things that fell under that category of welfare. And that's something that we're going to see in future weeks as we talk more about sort of how the New Deal legacy persisted after FDR left office. The other thing that's happening here that's sort of less simple than it seems is that the Social Security Administration ended up being built on a foundation that was fundamentally racist. So this is going to be sort of a familiar story to us by this point. But as we know, the Democratic Party at this point is splitting, right? We have an increasingly left-leaning party in the North, a party that is identified with workers, that's identified with immigrants. And in the South, we have a Democratic Party that is still very much the party of white supremacy, very much the party of the sort of old Southern Confederacy. And FDR is a Northern Democrat. He's from New York. He wants to get this very broad-based liberal reform plan passed. But in order to do that, he needs